So now we're going to start looking at in that symbol. Look at five Quaker wills. We're going to look at Henry Gallop's will, John Holder's will, and three wills from the Foster family. George Foster, his wife Hester, and his cousin Thomas Forster or Foster. We get into the nuts and bolts. This one is going to be a little bit on the long side. Apologies up front, but hopefully you will enjoy it. There's a lot of questions. Here is a series of extracts from wills in the archives. This is page 134 of volume 1 of the Wills and Administrations prepared by Joanne McCree, Saunders McCree. So how do you know from looking at this who is a Quaker and who isn't? Well, all you have to do is to look down here at this man, William Penn. William Penn is described as a friend of Henry Gallop, planter. He's the son of the late General or Admiral Penn in London. William Penn was a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends. So we can say that, without doubt, that Henry Gallop was a Quaker. If you zoom in some more, look a little closer, you will see that he names also Christopher Codrington as his friend. This is in 1680. So this would be the second generation Codrington, not the one who left Codrington College to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts. So Christopher Codrington was a Quaker as well. And then there's a whole set of other men: William Sharp, John Waterman, Edward Benny, John Sutton, Richard Sutton, John Holder Sr., Richard Hoskins, Thomas Clark, and John Waite. Okay, so all of these were Quakers as well. You can see where he worshipped as well. And look right here, where he says, when he names the oh, look, it starts actually from here, up here. Friends, or his son, Robert Gallop, daughters, Catherine Gallop, Anne Gallop, and Mary Gallop, son, Samuel Gallop, eldest sons, Henry Gallop, John Gallop, and William Gallop, son, Solomon Gallop, said Robert, Catherine, Samuel, and Mercy Gallop, friend Robert Thorpe. Another set of Quakers. But look at this now. Who does he name as guardians of his children? The Friends of the Spring Meeting. The Spring Meeting was in St. Thomas, up by Cane Field. Quite interesting, because clearly there are a lot of Quakers named in this will. So if you look up a little bit higher at other, you can see that this one, Gagan Cornelius, friend, Matthew Gorman, and Cornelius Bryant. So we know that Cornelius Bryant was a Quaker, as were Matthew Gorman and Cornelius. Right. If you go up to Futter in St. Lucie, what does he have to say? He names his friend Thomas Forster and Peter Hancock. So just in this one page with one, two, three, four, five names, you've identified several, more than 10 Quakers. So it's looking as though the whole of Barbados might have been Quakers. It turns out that is what happens. All of them were Quakers in 1680 at least. So this is a pretty interesting fact. You, you can easily find out who is a Quaker just by looking at their will. And if they use the word friend, they're members of the Society of Friends and they identify other people who are also Quakers. You'll also see that the use of the complicated use of dating. 25th of a month called July. A month called July. July is a month in the Julian calendar, which is Roman Catholic. So he doesn't want to use anything that is associated with Roman Catholic, but he has used the month July. But he's saying I don't really. Some people call it that, but I don't really subscribe to it. But because people call it that, I'm using it. So there you have it. That's how you know how people were Quakers in that period, in the 1700s. From this series, this 3-volume series done by Joanne Saunders McCree. Pretty neat. Here's the 1675 Ford map of Barbados. Ford was a Quaker. Everybody accepts that. The, the appearance of Friends plantations on the map suggests that the map was commissioned by an organization who wanted Friends plantations to be accounted for. Most logical organization would be the Society of Friends. The names on this map are going to are going to be the membership list of the Society of Friends in Barbados. So let's start with one will, the will of Henry Gallop or Gollop. I use Gallop and Gollop sometimes interchangeably, so bear with me. Henry Gallop names William Penn as a friend and other people. William Penn is undisputably a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends. So it means that Henry Gallop was also a member of the Society of Friends. All of the other names in Henry Gallop's will are also, once they're identified as friends, they are also members of the Society of Friends. So if you start to turn on those names, this is what it looks like. Codrington, Christopher Codrington, Sutton, Thorpe, Waite, Sharp, Hoskins up in St. Lucie, far away, Holder, Waterman, and so on. If you zoom in, and put on the network, that's what you end up with. You actually have a network. You have a network of friends. That's what the membership of the Society of Friends did for you. It made you a member of a network, a church, if you like. So let me move around and show you what it looks like. So here's Hoskins up in St. Lucie. Here's Thorpe in St. James. Here's Sutton at the Bell. Sorry, at what at Warren's. He's at Warren's. Sharp at Mount Wilton. Denny at Malvern. Codrington over here at Codrington. The Society. We zoom in a little bit closer. You'll see Waterman Senior. I also put in Waterman Junior over here. Thomas Clark, John Holder. So if this principle is continued, wait, if this principle is continued for every one of these names, I would assert that everyone will turn out to be a Quaker or a member of the Society of Friends. So we have a way to use to find out from the wills in that period who was a member of the Society of Friends and who wasn't. So now we're going to look at a couple of other wills. Here is John Holder's will from St. Joseph's Parish. It doesn't say whether he's a merchant or a planter. And the interesting thing here is that he basically is making provision for his dwelling to be allowed for continued meetings of friends. This is taken from page 173 of volume 2 of the Barbados Wills and Administrations, prepared by Joanne McCree Saunders, long time ago, probably in the 70s or 80s. If you look on this page, you'll see there's another holder here. He died in 1690, so he's after John Holder. He died after John Holder, possibly a different generation. But if you look at this will, he's mentioning a merchant, friend, so clearly he's a Quaker, as is Joseph Pike. Come up a little bit and look at Hodgson. No mention. Again, you see a merchant. Everybody is linked to somehow to a merchant because trade is the important activity. Hogston. We have friends, John Hayes and Thomas Montfort. What to Hogan. Doesn't look as look, friend Richard Forster. Richard Forster was at Waterford and St. Michael. And there is buried a Quaker called Simpson. He's one of the Valiant 16. Richard Forstall's house is where George Fox stayed when he first came to Barbados in 1671 and was pretty sick. He recovered at his house. So here is John Holder's will. He's setting up more or less to continue a, a church or a meeting at his house for friends after his death. Here is John Holder. He was at Joe's River. I've given him a star because his dwelling has been in the past or previous to his will and will be after he's gone, be used as a meeting for friends. So Gallop has identified him as a friend, and as we will see, Foster as well identifies him as a friend. Here is one of his witnesses. I think it's Joseph Joy. Sometimes it's spelled J, sometimes it's spelled Joy. You'll find usually that wills, the witnesses and the friends in the wills are very often close neighbours. You're going to look at Foster and Todd now, and Foster, and that will then lead to Todd, which is the next, after Foster and Todd, the next will to look at. What I would like to now is to look at the Foster family. In this Foster family, Foster 1, who is in business with Todd on the seashore, probably a merchant, maybe a smuggler, maybe a fisherman, and Foster 2, who looks like he is Foster Hall. His neighbors are Howe, or their neighbors are Howe, Beetle Sr., Weston, and Beetle Jr. So let's look at this will which best fits those facts. George Foster, he's in St. John's Parish, yeah. His wife is Hester Foster. Good, we'll keep that in mind. And is in partnership with John Todd. That's the killer. This is the guy that I want. His land bounds cousin Thomas Foster, so that would be at Foster Hall, and Henry Weston, who would be on the cliff. He has a daughter called Mary Foster from Hester Foster. He named friends called Quakers, which is saying he's a Quaker, and he actually gets more specific and calls out John Holder, who we met, Thomas Foster, the cousin, and John Todd, who we will meet. He also mentions Samuel Shattock, now in New England. George Foster is probably a merchant, and he's in trade with Samuel Shattock, now in New England. That looks like the best explanation there. They could be smugglers too, but you never know. His witnesses are Samuel Fort, who becomes or at least who gets to own Henry Sweet's plantation, which is now Haynes Hill. Other witnesses are Richard Way, William Wilson, Edmund Haynes, that would be Newcastle area, and Thomas Steely. The wife, Hester, who he has a daughter with, is a widow, was a widow when he married her. She's a relict of Richard Petty. So if you look up here, you'll see that he leaves something, or at least he has a consideration in there for his wife's son and sisters, and his wife's daughters as well. They're both under 14. So he married Hester Petty when she was quite young. He died in 1670. So let's look now at Hester's will and see what she has to say. She's a widow of George Foster of Barbados. Whereas George Foster died in 1670, she survives him by 16 years. So she was probably younger than he was, but maybe not. The poor, she basically takes into consideration the poor of St. John's Parish. That's a characteristic of the Quakers. Many wills you'll see that end up. Let's move this across a little bit so that you can see it better. Sorry about that. The poor of St. John's Parish. She names friends Colonel Thomas Colleton and John Holder. Executors are friends Sutton, who we met, Robbins, who I can't find, and John Braffett, also who I can't find. Now, there's a third Foster will, which is worthwhile looking at as well. That is the will of Thomas Foster, the cousin to George Foster. So let's let me shut this down here for a minute, and I'll get his will up. Here's Here's Thomas Foster's will. He dies in St. Philip, 1684. He dies before Hester. His son-in-law he names as Thomas Pilgrim. So, and his son is Elias Pilgrim at 21. So it sounds like Elias Pilgrim is going to be Thomas Pilgrim's son. To the two of them, he gives a plantation where I live, which he bought of John Higginbotham. That's Bushy Park in St. Philip. Sometimes Foster is spelled Forster. So he has another son called George, and he gives him the plantation below the cliff. That would be Foster Hall that we just looked at. And the land and storehouses belonging thereto on Hackleton's cliff. Thomas Pilgrim Jr., brother to Elias, grandson Thomas Foster at 27, and not sooner, son of George Foster, houses in Bridgetown. So let's go forward a little bit and see what else he says. Because it starts to get really interesting. Again, he's dealing with the poor of St. Joseph's, and the friends belong to the 5 several meetings of Quakers. There would be Heathcote's Bay, which we looked at before, Spring Meeting, which we also looked at. There'll be Bridge Meeting at Bridgetown. There'll be Pumpkin Hill Meeting in St. Lucie, and there'll be the Cliff Meeting. I got a location for a meeting, a Quaker meeting from the 1722 map. around Four Roads in St. Philip. But I'm not sure if that's really the cliff meeting because it's pretty far from the cliff. Um, but I'll mark that still on the map as a meeting. But look what else he says. First of all, he says that the present wife is Rachel Foster, the daughter of John Todd and Elizabeth Todd of Barbados. So obviously, the cousin George Foster, who was in business with John Todd, showed that the Todd family and the Foster family are close. But look at what he says here. To be buried in my vault at Hackleton Cliff by my former wife. Plantation where St. John Foster is. Okay. So he's a Quaker. He's buried. He has a vault on top of Hackleton Cliff. And he's to be buried in there with his wife, his first wife. So we got an answer to what that vault on top of Hackleton's Cliff is all about. About 11 years ago, I was up that side and I actually took a video of the sign listing who is buried in there. Again, that is I think a Richard Goddard effort. Um, Mary Gleedall probably is involved with that as well. I think the sign was updated recently, but I haven't been up there for a while now. So we know who is in the vault, or at least who others who have researched have found to be in the vault. And you see the vault, it starts operating in 1685. Yeah, so it's 1685 he dies. 1685 he dies. Proof 14th of May 1685. The will is actually written 1684, 8th month. March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October. October in 1684. Next. Okay. So keep a keep an eye on this pilgrim name as well in St. Philip. Let me get out there and start looking at him a little closer because you may recognize that name as one of the names buried in the Quaker burying ground just close to St. Philip's Church. And I think that is the pilgrim from Bushy Park. All linked together. So, joy. It's a map showing how the Foster family is linked into other Quakers. 35 Quaker meetings, best as I can see. Pumpkin Hill in St. Lucie, out by Lambert's, Heathcote's Bay, Spring, Bridge, and the cliff. But seeing the cliff is here, I think this is not right. I think it should be closer here. And I have an idea where it might be. I forgot to say that Esther Foster is also linked to Bill Carpenter in Pennsylvania. He's a merchant. He was in Barbados for a while, and then he must have bought land in Pennsylvania and moved there once it became available in 1681. So again, you see, besides the Samuel Shattuck in New England, you see another merchant here, Samuel Carpenter, trading with Hester Foster. So I've put two Fosters here. I put a George Foster and a Hester Foster. I have their links overseas. They're both linked to John Holder, but different generation John Holder. Because John Holder is because when Hester wrote her will, George Foster's link to John Holder had been broken because John Holder died. So this would be his son. But remember, the father left the house available to friends for their meetings. This is Foster Hall. So that is shown linked to Bushy Park because there are two plantations owned by Thomas Foster. His family is going to be Quaker, so his son, who he left Foster Hall to, will also be a Quaker, to the best of my belief. Esther Foster, sorry, George Foster is also linked to John Todd. You'll see a little bit more about him soon. And Hester Foster is linked to Colonel Thomas Colleton, which would be Colleton Plantation. So this best displays how the network for the Foster family worked. So you can see they're building up an absolute spider's web. So hope you enjoyed this presentation. I think I've said all I wanted to say.